Hey guys, tonight we slip beneath the velvet curtains of medieval palaces, where stone walls echoed with whispers far saucier than monks would ever dare to write down. You're not drifting into some sanitized classroom lecture. Nope, you're sliding into the perfumed chambers of queens who bent rules, wielded charm like a dagger, and made the gossip of their age. Eleanor of Aquitaine is waiting for you tonight, radiant, restless, and very much unwilling to sit quietly and embroider while men played their little games of thrones. You'll find yourself in candlelit halls thick with intrigue, where love letters can tip kingdoms and a marriage bed becomes a battlefield. And honestly, you probably won't survive this story if you expect medieval women to be passive, meek, or prudish, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and hey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing our little nighttime community stretching across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through dusty Angevin corridors, your footsteps muffled on rush strewn floors. Eleanor of Aquitaine waits, a queen who scandalized chroniclers and thrilled poets. Born around 1122, she wasn't just wealthy, she inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, a land nearly a third of modern France. Imagine being a teenager and suddenly ruling more territory than most kings. Eleanor knew her worth, and she didn't hesitate to play the game with both elegance and audacity. She married young to Louis VII of France, a pious man whose soul burned for crusades more than for his dazzling wife. The pair marched east together on the Second Crusade, and here the stories turn delicious. While Louis stumbled through military blunders, Eleanor was rumored to have grown just a little too close to her uncle Raymond of Antioch. The whispers that they were more than allies. Historians still argue whether Eleanor truly took Raymond into her bed, or if it was just the jealous invention of clerics who distrusted a woman with charisma sharper than their sermons. Either way, the marriage soured, and Eleanor's scandalous independence became undeniable. Picture her, riding in silk and armor beneath the Levantine sun, surrounded by soldiers stunned by a queen who refused to sit quietly in the rear. It's not hard to imagine the mutterings of monks, a woman leading. Surely the devil's work. You chuckle softly at the thought, if Eleanor were alive today, she'd probably dominate reality TV, sipping wine while dropping lines that left nobles scrambling. Back in France, the annulment came quickly, with Louis citing her lack of producing sons. Convenient, isn't it? The church might have frowned, but Eleanor slipped free with her duchy intact, and within mere weeks, she remarried, this time to Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. You can almost hear the collective gasp of Europe. One moment she's Queen of France, the next, Queen of England, with land stretching across Europe like a patchwork quilt stitched together by sheer audacity. Henry was fiery, ambitious, and restless. Sound familiar? Sparks flew, both in passion and in fury. Their marriage produced a brood of legendary children, including Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. And yet, behind palace doors, Eleanor's personal life was a battlefield. Henry strayed often, his mistresses known and unknown, while Eleanor carved her own reputation for intrigue. Chroniclers, often men terrified of powerful women, painted her as dangerously seductive, a schemer whose influence poisoned her sons against their father. Historians still debate whether she actively encouraged rebellion or merely tolerated her children's fiery independence. In 1173, she was accused of supporting the Great Revolt against Henry. Imagine the scene: Eleanor, gray-eyed and resolute, her sons sharpening swords in darkened halls, their plans whispered over candle flames. The rebellion failed, and Henry had Eleanor locked away for years, a queen in name, but a prisoner in practice. Yet even captivity couldn't erase her allure. Troubadours still sang of her beauty, her wit, her boldness. Some claim she hosted the fabled courts of love in Aquitaine, where knights debated matters of romance under her judgment. Was it real? Or just another fantasy embroidered by poets hungry for patronage? Historians still argue whether those courts ever existed. But the image lingers, Eleanor reclining in a hall, listening to squires argue whether true love excuses adultery. You shuffle through these imagined halls, the rushes crunching faintly underfoot, the air heavy with rosemary and candle wax. Eleanor's presence feels alive, a queen whose reputation was too fiery to be dimmed by centuries of dust. She eventually regained her freedom after Henry's death, ruling as regent while Richard the Lionheart thundered off to crusade. Imagine that, a woman in her 70s commanding armies, negotiating treaties, and still unnerving bishops with her sheer refusal to fade quietly into the shadows. And those bishops, oh, how they scowled. They muttered about her perversions, her lusts, her schemes. But behind their Latin condemnations lies something simpler, fear. Fear of a woman who would not be tamed, who could topple kings with a marriage, stir rebellions with a glance, and outlive nearly everyone who tried to contain her. One quirky tidbit you might enjoy: Eleanor was grandmother to Blanche of Castile, who would one day raise Louis IX of France, a king canonized as a saint. Imagine bedtime stories in that family, grandma reminiscing about crusades, scandals, and rebellions, while the little one listened wide-eyed, later growing into a ruler drenched in piety. Family dinners must have been fascinating. So you linger here, half asleep, half enchanted, the scent of roses and old stone mixing in your imagination. Eleanor of Aquitaine wasn't just a queen, she was a living storm, a reminder that medieval women weren't cloistered dolls but forces of history. And as your eyelids grow heavy, her voice seems to echo softly, let them whisper. I ruled anyway. You wander down shadowy corridors where the cold drafts of English castles brush against your skin. Behind every oak door, behind every embroidered curtain, you can almost hear secrets hissing. Tonight, it is Isabella of France who steps forward, her jeweled crown glinting in the torchlight, her smile just a little too sharp to be entirely sweet. They called her the She-Wolf of France, which sounds more like a metal band than a queen's nickname, but it suits her. She was dangerous, calculating, and far too clever to let herself be overshadowed by a husband like Edward II of England. Born around 1295, Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, though he was less fair in morals and more in bone structure. Imagine growing up in a court where diplomacy was a blood sport and everyone around you was plotting. Isabella learned early that survival meant charm mixed with a hint of ruthlessness. When she was sent to marry Edward II in 1308, she carried her elegance like armor, but the English court was not prepared for her. Edward II, bless his awkward heart, had hobbies more suited for a medieval hipster. He liked ditch digging, hanging out with commoners, and, most scandalously, pouring his affections onto favorites, men like Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was flashy, arrogant, and soaked up Edward's attention like a sponge. Imagine being Isabella, young, radiant, politically vital. And married to a king who couldn't take his eyes off someone else. Chroniclers, ever eager for gossip, hinted at a relationship that went beyond friendship. Historians still argue whether Edward's connection with Gaveston was a true romance or simply an intensely political partnership, but either way, Isabella was humiliated. You can almost picture the whispers, lords grumbling about their king's favoritism, courtiers smirking behind their hands at Isabella's apparent neglect. It must have stung. Yet Isabella didn't crumble, she watched, learned, and waited. When Gaveston was eventually executed by barons fed up with his influence, Isabella played her role of dutiful queen, but she never forgot the sting of betrayal. Edward, however, didn't learn. Along came the Despencer family, especially Hugh Despencer the Younger. Where Gaveston was flamboyant, Hugh was manipulative and greedy. He wrapped himself around Edward's reign, squeezing power and wealth until nobles howled with resentment. Isabella, now older and sharper, was pushed to the margins, stripped of resources, and even denied access to her children at one point. Picture her pacing in her chambers, her hands cold, her heart smoldering. Queens weren't supposed to plot, but Isabella was no ordinary queen. A quirky tidbit: During these years, Isabella apparently rode through London barefoot, dressed in penitential garb, begging the people for support. Whether it really happened or was a later embellishment, the image is unforgettable, France's elegant daughter transformed into a barefoot plea for justice. You can almost hear the sympathetic murmurs of Londoners, torn between loyalty and disgust at their king. In 1325, Isabella seized her chance. Sent to France as a diplomat, she refused to return to Edward. Instead, she allied with Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron who had escaped from the Tower of London. Together, they became one of the most infamous power couples of the Middle Ages. Isabella and Mortimer plotted invasion, gathering support from disaffected English nobles and even her own son, the future Edward III. Imagine the gossip. A queen consorting with a rebel lord, their alliance dripping with both politics and passion. Chroniclers, unable to resist, painted their relationship as scandalously intimate. Historians still argue whether Isabella's partnership with Mortimer was love, lust, or sheer political convenience, but whatever it was, it worked. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England. Picture yourself trudging along with their small army, the autumn air damp, banners snapping overhead. Edward II's support melted away like butter on hot bread. The once mighty king fled, abandoned by allies, and was captured. Isabella stood triumphant, not just as queen consort but as queen in fact. Edward II was deposed in favor of young Edward III, with Isabella ruling as regent alongside Mortimer. Here's where her story turns darker. Edward II was imprisoned, and in 1327 he died under mysterious circumstances. The grisly tale, of a red-hot poker used to ensure no visible wounds, still circulates in history classrooms like a ghost story. Historians still argue whether that infamous detail is true or just an invention by later chroniclers gleefully dramatizing events. What seems likely is that Isabella and Mortimer knew of, if not ordered, his death. After all, a living ex-king is a dangerous thing. As regent, Isabella basked in authority. For a brief time, she ruled England with Mortimer by her side, her silks rustling across council halls, her seal pressing wax into charters. But power is fickle, and ambition burns too bright. By 1330, young Edward III was tired of Mortimer's overreach. He staged a coup, capturing Mortimer and sending him to execution. Isabella, spared but disgraced, was confined to a quieter life, her political storm reduced to a whisper. One fringe tidbit: some later writers claim Isabella went mad in her final years, clutching a dagger and muttering about Mortimer. Others suggest she died peacefully in 1358, buried with surprising honor. Historians still debate the truth of her last chapter. Was she tormented by regrets, or quietly satisfied that she had once bent kingdoms to her will? You stand in her shadowed chambers, tapestries faded, the fire dim. Isabella's legacy is tangled in rumor and fear, but one thing remains clear: she was no passive consort. She was a wolf, prowling through history, her teeth glinting in the half-light. And as your eyelids grow heavier, you can almost hear her whisper through the stone: better to be feared than forgotten. You shuffle further into the candlelit labyrinth of medieval gossip, and now the air thickens with the perfume of oranges and frankincense. Somewhere in Naples, the Mediterranean breeze seeps through carved balconies, and you can almost hear the lapping of the sea beyond the stone walls. Here waits Joanna of Naples, also known as Joanna I, her life a swirl of crowns, marriages, rumors, and trials that turned her into both heroine and villain, depending on which monk you ask. Born in 1326, Joanna inherited the throne of Naples when she was barely in her teens. Imagine that, not even out of childhood, and suddenly the fate of a glittering, cosmopolitan kingdom rests on her shoulders. The city itself was no provincial backwater. Naples was a vibrant port, a crossroads of merchants, scholars, and schemers. And in the middle of this bustle was Joanna, a teenage girl already carrying the weight of dynasties. Her guardians, anxious about securing her throne, married her off to her Hungarian cousin Andrew. Poor Andrew, he was about as politically savvy as a sack of turnips. While Joanna had been raised in the sophistication of the Neapolitan court, Andrew seemed out of place, rustic, and painfully awkward. The people didn't warm to him, and whispers began spreading that Joanna, graceful and urbane, resented her clumsy husband. Here's where the scandal heats up. In 1345, Andrew was found murdered, strangled, some said, in a garden while hunting. The rumors swirled instantly. Had Joanna arranged it? Did her courtiers? Or was it simply nobles furious at Andrew's attempts to seize power? Historians still argue whether Joanna was the mastermind of the plot or merely a pawn swept up in aristocratic fury. The church, of course, didn't like the optics. A queen with a dead husband makes for juicy sermons. Imagine the scene, you, standing in the garden, the torchlight flickering, Andrew's body lying crumpled while courtiers glanced nervously around. Joanna herself insisted on her innocence, but the stain of suspicion never washed away. That's the curse of medieval rumor. Once whispered, it echoes for centuries. After Andrew's death, Joanna remarried. Several times. First, to Louis of Taranto, a match that gave her both stability and scandal, depending on which noble you asked. Their union looked politically strong, but it did little to stop tongues wagging. Later, she married James IV of Majorca, who brought more baggage than benefit, and eventually Otto of Brunswick, whose Germanic charm was, let's say, situational. For husbands in total, each marriage dragging her deeper into the mire of court politics. A queen collecting husbands like chess pieces tends to attract judgment. Chroniclers loved painting her as lustful, fickle, or perverse. But you know what? Maybe she was just practical. Power in Naples wasn't stable, and marriages were weapons sharper than swords. One quirky tidbit: Joanna's court was unusually tolerant for its time. She gave shelter to poets, philosophers, and even figures considered heretical elsewhere. Boccaccio, the famous author of the Decameron, admired her enough to dedicate works to her. Imagine reclining in her palace as scholars read bawdy tales aloud while courtiers sipped spiced wine. It must have felt more like a salon than a throne room. Still, the shadow of Andrew's death followed her. The Pope, unsatisfied with her explanations, eventually summoned her to Avignon to face trial. Picture yourself trudging into that papal court, the air thick with incense, cardinals glaring over crimson sleeves, Joanna standing in shimmering robes, her head high. Against all odds, she defended herself eloquently, convincing Pope Clement VI that she wasn't guilty. He even formally acquitted her. It was a shocking victory, though critics back home sneered that money and charm spoke louder than justice, but her troubles weren't over. The Hungarians, furious over Andrew's death, invaded Naples. Joanna fled, only to return later with help, reclaiming her kingdom like a phoenix rising from ashes. She ruled for decades, defying expectations that she'd crumble under scandal. Yet the whispers never ceased, rumors of lovers, of poisonings, of wild intrigues. Historians still argue whether she was a shrewd monarch unfairly maligned, or a manipulator who cloaked ambition with charm. Her end was just as dramatic. In 1382, her cousin Charles of Durazzo, supported by Hungarian allies, captured Naples. Joanna was imprisoned in the fortress of Muro Lucano. And there, in a twist fit for a grim bedtime story, she was strangled to death at the age of 55. It's chilling to imagine, the once gilded queen, who had outmaneuvered popes and princes, silenced in a dark cell by the same weapon that killed her first husband. History loves irony, even when it's cruel. As you shuffle back through her candlelit halls, you can almost hear her laugh, a low, defiant sound echoing against marble. A queen who refused to be quiet, who danced through scandal and still managed to reign for nearly 4 decades. Whether temptress, tyrant, or tragic heroine, Joanna of Naples left a mark you can't quite brush away. And as you drift closer to sleep, Her words seemed to hover like perfume, let them judge. I was queen. Your footsteps echo against the flagstones as you pass into the hushed corridors of Burgundy. The torches sputter, and you catch the faint scent of wine drifting from distant cellars. Here waits Marguerite of Burgundy, her story entangled not so much in ruling kingdoms but in whisper-soft scandals that shook the very heart of the French monarchy. Her name is woven into one of the juiciest episodes of medieval rumor, the Tour de Nesle affair. Marguerite was no ordinary noblewoman. She was the daughter of Duke Robert II of Burgundy and, through marriage, became the wife of Louis, the eldest son of King Philip IV of France. That meant she was destined to be queen consort one day, crown, prestige, all the trimmings. But the court of France was a goldfish bowl where every glance, every gesture, every late-night whisper was magnified. And in that fishbowl, scandal bubbled up like algae in summer heat. The tale begins around 1314. Rumors spread that Marguerite and her sisters-in-law, Blanche and Jean, were conducting secret affairs. Not discreet little flirtations, mind you, but full-on meetings with two dashing knights, the brothers Philippe and Gauthier d'Aunay. And where did these supposed trysts occur? In the Tour de Nesle, a tower along the Seine in Paris. Picture it, clandestine meetings by torchlight, silken gowns rustling against stone, knights slipping through shadowy staircases. And the city asleep outside. A medieval soap opera with just enough truth, or imagination, to ignite a royal scandal. Now, did Marguerite actually do it? Historians still argue whether these affairs were real or fabricated by political enemies. Chroniclers loved scandal like TikTok thrives on drama. A queen consort accused of adultery was too delicious to pass up. One version claims a servant girl betrayed the women, revealing how the knights' purses, embroidered with royal initials, gave them away. Imagine the panic when those purses were discovered, the entire affair unraveling like a poorly stitched seam. The consequences were brutal. The d'Aunay brothers were arrested and tortured. Their fate? Gruesome execution, flayed, broken on the wheel, and decapitated. You shudder, the firelight in your imagination casting long shadows. Meanwhile, Marguerite and Blanche were found guilty of adultery and imprisoned. Jean, whose involvement was less clear, escaped with lighter suspicion. For Marguerite, the fall from glittering court to dark cell was swift and merciless. A quirky tidbit, the Tour de Nesle scandal wasn't just gossip, it altered the line of succession. Philip IV died later that year. And his son Louis became Louis X. That meant Marguerite, technically, was Queen of France while imprisoned. Talk about awkward, your husband crowned king while you sit in a cold stone room, your title intact but your dignity shredded. Her marriage to Louis was annulled, but the crown couldn't shake off the stain of scandal. Marguerite lingered in prison, her health failing. She died in 1315, barely a year after the scandal erupted. Some say she succumbed to illness, others whisper she was quietly strangled on Louis's orders, clearing the path for him to remarry. Historians still debate her true end, and whether the Tour de Nesle affair was genuine adultery or a carefully crafted political trap. As you drift through the silence of her prison cell, you notice how history remembers women differently. Knights caught in betrayal. They get tortured, yes, but they also get remembered as tragic, romantic figures. Queens accused. Their names are smeared for centuries. Marguerite of Burgundy may have been guilty, or may have been innocent, but either way, she became a cautionary tale whispered across France. The scandal rippled outward too. Louis X died young, sparking a succession crisis that eventually led to the 100 Years' War. Imagine that, an alleged late-night affair in a Parisian tower playing a role in the centuries-long feud between France and England. Butterflies flap their wings, and suddenly you have armies marching across Europe. One fringe tidbit, centuries later, French dramatists and novelists seized on the Tour de Nesle story, turning it into plays and lurid tales. In the 19th century, Alexandre Dumas himself wrote a sensational play about it, complete with passion, betrayal, and melodrama. Even in modern times, the image of queens sneaking knights into shadowy towers proves irresistible. You shuffle away from the dim cell where Marguerite's life ebbed out, the air stale and heavy. Perhaps she did find secret passion in the Tour de Nesle, or perhaps she was simply a victim of courtly backstabbing. Either way, her story lingers like perfume on faded fabric, faint, elusive, impossible to wash out. And as your eyelids grow heavier, you hear her whisper, tinged with defiance, "They locked me away, but my scandal outlived them all." You wander now into dim corridors thick with the scent of incense and gunpowder. The French court fades away, and in its place rises the somber grandeur of the Valois court in the mid-1500s. Heavy velvet curtains, tapestries of battles and hunts, and the faint chime of astrologers' instruments fill the background. Here presides Catherine de' Medici, the Italian queen consort of France, often cast as the ultimate schemer, part mother, part monarch, part alleged poisoner. Her name alone is enough to make a historian raise an eyebrow, for her legend is embroidered with both fact and whispered horror. Catherine was born in 1519 into the mighty Medici family of Florence. If you think Medici and immediately imagine bankers, art, and a suspicious number of daggers hidden under banquet tables, you're on the right track. Orphaned young, Catherine spent her childhood shuttled between convents and palaces, learning patience and survival. At 14, she was married off to Henry, the future Henry II of France. He already had a mistress, the elegant Diane de Poitiers, who remained his favorite for life. You can imagine Catherine at court, outwardly composed, inwardly calculating, while Diane pranced about with pearls and Henry's attention. When Henry died in 1559, Catherine finally stepped into the light. Her son Francis too inherited the throne but died within a year. Then came Charles IX, then Henry III. 3 sons in a row, each leaning heavily on their mother's iron-spined guidance. Catherine became Queen Mother and Regent, the true power behind the Valois throne. To her supporters, she was a stabilizing force in a France torn apart by religious wars. To her enemies, she was a dark sorceress, a poisoner, a Machiavellian puppet master who kept apothecaries and astrologers on speed dial. One mainstream fact: Catherine genuinely was a patron of science and astrology. She kept the famed Nostradamus close, consulting him on prophecies. Picture her in a candlelit chamber, the air thick with herbs, an astrologer whispering predictions about plagues and kings. Did she believe him? Perhaps. Did it add to her mystique? Absolutely. The darker side of her legend revolves around poison. Whispers accused her of using a poison cabinet of perfumed gloves, tainted books, and lethal powders to quietly eliminate enemies. Historians still argue whether Catherine ever actually dabbled in poisonings or if these were Gothic exaggerations by Protestant pamphleteers desperate to demonize her. Either way, the image stuck. Even today, when you say Catherine de' Medici, many people picture a queen stirring vials rather than drafting treaties. The most infamous event tied to her reign was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. Picture the streets of Paris, August heat clinging to stone, bells tolling at dawn. Huguenot Protestants, gathered in the city for a royal wedding, were suddenly slaughtered in waves of violence. Some chroniclers claimed Catherine orchestrated the bloodshed to rid France of her son's enemies. Others suggest she was simply trying to prevent rebellion and lost control of the chaos. Historians still debate whether Catherine was the cold architect of the massacre or just a regent caught in a perfect storm of fanaticism and fear. Either way, thousands died, and her reputation as a ruthless queen was sealed, yet Catherine wasn't only blood and scandal. She adored spectacle, turning court life into theater. Her court hosted elaborate ballets, masks, and festivals, many choreographed with political symbolism. Imagine standing in a vast hall lit by hundreds of candles, dancers in mythological costumes twirling while Catherine watches, her face serene, her mind always calculating. She believed that performance could pacify nobles as much as politics could. Think of it as medieval spin doctoring with extra velvet. A quirky tidbit: Catherine introduced Italian cuisine and utensils to France. She popularized the fork, that little two-pronged instrument that baffled medieval diners. Picture a French noble clumsily poking at a roast with his foreign fork while Catherine daintily twirls a bite, smug in her refinement. It's funny how something as simple as cutlery can reshape culture, but Catherine's reputation as the Black Queen persisted. Pamphlets painted her as a depraved Italian seductress, mixing poison into wine goblets, whispering into her son's ears, and dabbling in occult arts. Modern scholars remind us that much of this was propaganda fueled by the religious wars. Still, the imagery lingers: Catherine's silhouette gliding through smoky corridors, a ring concealing a lethal drop of poison, her eyes gleaming like onyx. She died in 1589, just months before the assassination of her last son, Henry III. By then, her influence was waning, her body weakened, but her legend had already crystallized. Whether mother, poisoner, patron, or puppet master, Catherine de' Medici was a queen who terrified and fascinated in equal measure. As you leave her perfumed chambers, the torchlight flickers, and you can almost smell bitter almonds in the air. Was it poison, or just your imagination? Catherine's voice seems to follow you, smooth and cold: better they fear me than forget me. You drift now into the cold light of northern skies, where the air bites sharper and the architecture stiffens into Lutheran austerity. Velvet and incense fall away, and instead the scent of snow, wax, and ink greets you. Here is Christina of Sweden, a queen remembered not for discreet marriages or predictable courtly manners but for her gleeful disregard of both. If earlier queens scandalized because they broke the rules in private, Christina scandalized because she refused to play by any rules at all. Born in 1626, Christina was the only surviving child of King Gustavus Adolphus, the so-called Lion of the North. He died in battle when she was 6, leaving her to inherit the Swedish throne. Imagine being a small child, bundled in ermine, your father's general swearing loyalty to you while you're still struggling to sit still during lessons. She grew up in an environment thick with expectation. Sweden was a Protestant powerhouse, respected across Europe, and this little girl was supposed to embody its future, yet Christina never quite fit the mold. For starters, she dressed in ways that confused everyone, sometimes in gowns, sometimes in men's coats, often with an energy that defied convention. Visitors described her as walking quickly, talking too much, and slouching rather than gliding. Not very queenly, in other words. Historians still argue whether she was simply eccentric, a tomboy in a rigid age, or perhaps expressing something more complex about gender identity centuries before the vocabulary existed. When she took the throne in 1644, the Swedish nobility braced themselves. Christina loved philosophy, theater, art, and long conversations more than she loved war or taxes. She invited scholars like René Descartes to her court. Imagine poor Descartes, the famous thinker, dragged out of bed in the freezing Stockholm dawn to debate metaphysics with an energetic young queen who insisted on morning sessions. He died not long after, probably of pneumonia, though some whispered Christina's relentless schedule helped speed his demise. A mainstream fact: Christina never married, despite enormous pressure. A royal marriage could have secured alliances, heirs, and stability. But Christina flat out refused. She toyed with proposals, dangled possibilities, then waved them away. She reportedly told her council that she had an aversion to marriage and to being commanded. You almost smirk hearing that. Try telling a room full of 17th century noblemen that you simply aren't feeling it. Of course, this independence fueled rumors. Christina surrounded herself with close female companions, most famously Ebba Sparre, to whom she wrote passionate letters. Were they simply intimate friends in a courtly tradition of flowery affection, or was their relationship romantic? Historians still debate whether Christina and Ebba crossed into love or whether modern readers project onto her what the age could not articulate. What's undeniable is that Christina relished defying expectations of who and how she should love. A quirky tidbit: Christina reportedly horrified courtiers by swearing, riding astride like a man, and refusing to bathe often. Ambassadors noted that she smelled, shall we say, earthy. Imagine being a polished French envoy, bowing before the Queen, and then realizing you'd rather stand a few extra paces away. Then came her most shocking move. In 1654, Christina abdicated. Picture it, a grand ceremony, courtiers packed into the hall, Christina standing proudly as she stripped off crown, scepter, and ermine, handing them to her cousin Charles Gustave. In her early 20s, she simply walked away from one of the most powerful thrones in Europe. Why? Partly exhaustion, partly wanderlust, and partly because she had a secret. That secret was her conversion to Catholicism. For a queen raised as the Protestant hope of Europe, this was seismic. She left Sweden, traveled to Rome, and dramatically announced her new faith. The Vatican welcomed her like a celebrity convert, parading her through the streets. Imagine the mixture of scandal and awe, the Pope himself embracing a runaway Protestant queen, while Northern Europe fumed. Historians still argue whether Christina's conversion was a genuine spiritual transformation or a political move to secure patronage and freedom. In Rome, Christina reinvented herself as a patron of the arts. She surrounded herself with painters, poets, and musicians, turning her palace into a cultural hub. She flirted with cardinals, sparred with philosophers, and shocked her hosts with her bluntness. One story claims she killed a man during a quarrel, stabbing him in a fit of rage. Was it true, or just another Gothic embellishment to her reputation? Scholars remain divided, but it fits her image as a woman who never followed polite rules. She died in 1689, buried in St. Peter's Basilica, one of only a few women interred there. Think about that, the runaway Queen of Sweden, resting among popes, her marble tomb whispering of scandal and defiance. As you shuffle through her Roman chambers, walls hung with paintings and echoes of laughter, you feel the presence of someone who lived unapologetically. She refused marriage, gender norms, and religious expectations. To her contemporaries, she was eccentric, even perverted. To us, she feels startlingly modern. And as you grow drowsy, you hear her voice, sharp and amused, "I was never made to obey." The candlelight shifts again, and you find yourself gliding across the English Channel, where damp mist curls around stone palaces and whispers of court intrigue hang heavy in the air. The figure waiting for you this time is Margaret of Anjou, a woman who managed to scandalize not through flirtation or refusal but through her sheer audacity to wield power in ways men thought improper for a queen. Born in 1430, Margaret was a French princess married off at 15 to Henry VI of England. The marriage was meant to seal peace in the 100 Years' War, but instead it dropped her straight into one of the messiest political dramas of the age. Henry was pious, bookish, and unfortunately prone to bouts of mental illness. Imagine a king more interested in prayer than politics, more likely to lose himself in contemplation than to govern effectively. England's nobility quickly realized that Margaret was the one making the decisions. A mainstream fact, Margaret of Anjou effectively became the leader of the Lancastrian faction during the Wars of the Roses. When Henry collapsed into a catatonic state in 1453, Margaret stepped forward, managing the court, arranging alliances, and preparing for war. The image of a queen leading armies, riding at the head of troops, horrified some chroniclers. They called her a she-wolf, snarling and unnatural. And yet, to her supporters, she was a warrior queen defending her husband's crown. Of course, where there is a powerful woman in history, rumors of scandal follow. Whispers began that Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, was not Henry's child at all but the product of an affair. Was it with Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, her close ally? Or perhaps another nobleman who supplied what the fragile Henry could not? Historians still argue whether these accusations were political slander or if there was some truth buried beneath them. The fact remains, Margaret's son carried the Lancastrian claim, and his legitimacy was questioned until his dying breath. Here comes the quirky tidbit: during her time in exile in France, Margaret supposedly lived in near poverty, wandering the countryside disguised in ragged clothes, even begging for bread. Picture this: a queen once draped in silks now trudging through muddy lanes with her young son in tow, knocking on farmhouse doors. The image became part of her legend, showing both her fall and her tenacity. You can almost imagine her muttering, "Well, at least I don't have to sit through another council meeting." Yet Margaret was no meek figure in hardship. She was fierce, sometimes ferocious. At the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, she ordered the heads of her enemies, noblemen of the rival Yorkist faction, placed on spikes with mocking paper crowns. The brutality shocked contemporaries and fed the image of her as a bloodthirsty perverted queen, delighting in humiliation. Whether she truly orchestrated such displays or they were exaggerated by hostile chroniclers, historians still debate. But the story stuck. When her son Edward grew older, Margaret arranged for him to be engaged to Anne Neville, daughter of the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker. For a time, it looked like she had secured a powerful alliance. But as fate would have it, Warwick betrayed her, switched sides. And chaos deepened. The Wars of the Roses became a swirl of shifting loyalties, battles, and betrayals, with Margaret always at the heart of the storm. Her final act came in 1471 at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Imagine the scene: banners snapping in the wind, soldiers clashing in brutal combat, Margaret watching desperately as her son Edward, her pride, her justification, was killed on the battlefield. With him, her cause collapsed. Captured and humiliated, Margaret was paraded through London like a prize of war. She spent years in captivity before being ransomed back to France, where she lived the rest of her life quietly, a shadow of her former ferocity, but her reputation lingered. In Shakespeare's plays, Margaret appears as a cursing, vengeful presence, one of the most memorable female voices in his histories. She hurls insults, demands blood, and embodies everything that made her contemporaries uneasy about her, a queen who refused to be passive. As you drift now through a dim medieval hall, you hear her echo, boots pounding across flagstones, a voice sharp as a drawn sword. Margaret of Anjou was called unnatural, scandalous, perverted not because she betrayed her vows of chastity, but because she dared to act like a king when her king would not. In the dark, she still mutters, half pride and half bitterness, "Better a she-wolf than a sheep." The air grows heavier now, thick with incense and flickers of candlelight reflected on gold leaf. You find yourself wandering into the twisting corridors of the late medieval papal courts, but instead of solemn cardinals and obedient queens, you stumble into the orbit of someone who blurred both roles. This is Joanna II of Naples, a ruler whose notoriety was not whispered but shouted in chronicles, where politics, sex, and rumor swirled into one intoxicating legend. Joanna II reigned in the early 15th century, inheriting the throne of Naples in 1414. By then, the Mediterranean kingdom was already known for its instability, perched between the ambitions of France, Aragon, and the papacy. Yet what made Joanna so infamous was not merely the shifting alliances or constant wars, but her personal life, which chroniclers painted with gleeful scandal. A mainstream fact: Joanna II held power in her own right, an unusual position in a time when most queens were consorts or regents. She issued decrees, granted titles, and maneuvered between rival claimants. But she was also accused of corruption and caprice, never ruling with the predictability that nobles preferred. For her, politics seemed inseparable from personal indulgence. The rumors: Joanna supposedly maintained a string of lovers, many of them much younger men plucked from court. Chroniclers gleefully catalogued them, describing her chamber as a revolving door. Was this true, or was it misogynistic exaggeration aimed at a woman ruling without a husband's shadow? Historians still argue whether Joanna was genuinely promiscuous or simply the victim of political smear campaigns. Yet the stories endured, and in them, she becomes one of the most perverted queens in the medieval imagination. One lover in particular stands out: her chamberlain, Ser Gianni Caracciolo. He rose from minor nobility to become her closest companion, wielding enormous influence. For years, he essentially co-ruled Naples alongside her, making decisions, enriching himself, and provoking the envy of courtiers. Imagine the murmurs in the Great Hall: the Queen consults Ser Gianni more than her council. Perhaps in bed as well as in politics. Eventually, his arrogance and corruption grew so blatant that even Joanna had him assassinated. Picture the irony: her most notorious lover dying at her command, stabbed by men she herself sent. A quirky tidbit: chroniclers claimed that Joanna sometimes rewarded her favorites not only with titles and lands, but with her own jewelry and clothes. One report says she once gifted a lover a necklace worth more than a fortress. You can almost imagine him strutting around Naples, chest puffed, jangling with sapphires, while grumbling nobles seethed. Her reputation spread across Europe. The Pope himself, Martin V, scolded her for her lifestyle. Later, when she sought allies, rival monarchs hesitated, citing her fickleness. And yet, she managed to survive decades in power, weaving alliances with both France and Aragon, promising her throne to one side, then the other, like a gambler hedging bets. Her bedchamber and her council table seemed to overlap until no one could tell which truly guided her hand. The real tragedy is that Naples under her rule sank into corruption and decline. Nobles grew unruly, the treasury dwindled, and foreign armies hovered like vultures. Joanna clung to her throne through cunning and compromise, but she left behind little stability. When she died in 1435, childless and without a clear heir, her kingdom spiraled further into chaos, but her legend endured. To moralists, she was a warning about what happens when women rule unchecked: a queen turned courtesan, her lusts destabilizing a realm. To modern eyes, you sense both caricature and reality. Yes, she was manipulative, indulgent, and ruthless, but also a survivor in a world that preferred queens to stay silent. As you drift through the echoing halls of Castel Nuovo, the sea air carrying faint salt through the cracks, you imagine the queen's laughter. Was it bitter, triumphant, or simply amused at how history would remember her? Perhaps she whispers to you, conspiratorial: "They said I ruled with desire." But desire was power, and power was survival. You trudge into a colder, fog-laden northern Europe, where the wind carries the faint tang of pine and the distant clang of smithies. The figure waiting in the shadows is Hedvig Eleonora of Holstein-Gottorp, Queen Consort of Sweden and Mother of Kings, a woman whose life demonstrates that influence and scandal need not always involve adultery to earn notoriety. Instead, her audacity comes from an unrelenting grip on power, domestic intrigues, and her surprisingly bold personal choices. Born in 1636 in the Duchy of Holstein-Gottorp, Hedvig Eleonora arrived in Sweden as a teenager to marry Charles X Gustav. While at first glance she might have seemed a quiet, dutiful princess, she quickly learned that Swedish court life was a chessboard. And she was a masterful player. Hedvig Eleonora became queen consort during a period when Sweden was asserting itself militarily and politically, a time when marriages were political instruments, and women often wielded influence quietly behind velvet curtains. She, however, preferred to wield it openly, a mainstream fact. Hedvig Eleonora served as regent for her son Charles XI from 1660 to 1672 after her husband's death. During this period, she controlled the monarchy's day-to-day affairs, managed finances, and orchestrated the education of her children. She was no passive widow, she actively steered policy, earning admiration and resentment in equal measure. Rumors and whispers, however, were inevitable. Court observers often criticized her for being too controlling, too assertive, and for allegedly favoring her favorites in appointments, sometimes at the expense of merit or tradition. Historians still argue whether these accounts were biased misogyny or legitimate criticism of her political maneuvering. The perception of Hedvig Eleonora as manipulative earned her the label of scheming queen, a title that resonates with the whispering halls of history. A quirky tidbit: she had a penchant for the arts and architecture, commissioning lavish renovations to Stockholm Palace and building grand gardens. She reportedly enjoyed hosting salons where nobles and scholars debated philosophy, science, and literature. You can almost hear the echo of her laughter amid marble columns, the faint clinking of porcelain cups, and the rustle of embroidered gowns as she held court like a maestro directing a symphony. Her influence extended into personal realms as well. Hedvig Eleonora maintained a network of confidants and favorites, often women and men whose loyalty she could count on in both court politics and family intrigues. She was known to intervene in marriages, disputes, and even duels between nobles. Imagine a queen moving through her court with quiet authority, issuing subtle commands that shift alliances and alter fates. Historians still debate whether Hedvig Eleonora's assertiveness was typical of a politically aware queen or extraordinary for her time. She navigated succession disputes, managed her son's early governance, and survived factional rivalries without ever losing her throne or reputation entirely. In contrast to queens who scandalized with lovers or poison, her perversion, so to speak, was a relentless ambition and mastery of influence that unsettled the male-dominated court. One fringe tidbit: she reportedly wore male attire on certain occasions, not out of fashion, but to discreetly move through spaces and oversee operations that might have been off-limits to women. Imagine courtiers gasping as a young nobleman enters a council meeting, only to realize it is the queen herself. The blend of audacity and theater only heightened her legend. Hedvig Eleonora died in 1715, having outlived her son Charles XI and seen her grandson ascend as Charles XII. She had left a mark not through scandalous liaisons but through an unflinching hand in politics, art, and court life. As you step back from her palatial chambers, you feel the weight of her presence, a queen whose power, ambition, and clever manipulation redefined the boundaries of female influence in her era. You hear her voice, calm yet firm: a throne is not won by beauty or charm alone, it is won by presence and persistence. The corridors grow warmer, scented with orange blossoms and a faint tang of wine as you drift southward into the kingdom of Navarre. Here waits Blanche of Navarre, a queen whose life intertwined the mundane rules of dynastic politics with whispers of scandal, obsession, and forbidden desire. Her story reminds you that sometimes, the most perverse acts of queenship involve the manipulation of perception and obsession rather than overt acts of sex or violence. Born in 1387, Blanche was the daughter of Charles III of Navarre. She grew up surrounded by intrigue, learning early that words, gestures, and appearances could be more powerful than armies. In 1402, she married John II of Aragon, entering a court rife with factionalism and personal ambition. Her marriage, like many royal unions, was arranged for political expediency, but Blanche had ambitions beyond merely producing heirs. She sought influence, control, and recognition, and she was willing to use whatever tools she had to get it. A mainstream fact: Blanche of Navarre served as regent for her son, Charles, during his minority. As regent, she managed finances, diplomacy, and military decisions, often making unilateral decisions that shocked conservative courtiers. Her political engagement was formidable, yet it drew suspicion and resentment from nobles unaccustomed to female authority. Rumors soon followed. Blanche was said to favor particular courtiers, granting them titles, lands, and favors in exchange for personal loyalty. Some whispers even hinted at more intimate connections, suggestions of romantic entanglements that were never substantiated. Historians still argue whether these rumors reflected truth or were a product of male anxiety over a woman who exercised power freely and shrewdly. Regardless, her reputation as perverse or manipulative became embedded in Navarrese chronicles. A quirky tidbit: Blanche reportedly had a fascination with exotic animals and rare plants. She is said to have maintained a small menagerie and botanical collection, sometimes using them as allegories in courtly entertainment to teach lessons about power, loyalty, and desire. Imagine courtiers stepping carefully through rooms where monkeys clambered over tapestries or peacocks strutted in the sunlight, all orchestrated by a queen with a mischievous glint in her eye. Her intrigues didn't end there. Blanche was known for her sharp interventions in succession disputes and dynastic conflicts, occasionally clashing with other rulers, including her own son. She sometimes sent envoys with veiled threats, manipulated marriages, and orchestrated alliances that served both her family's and her personal interests. In essence, she treated politics like a chessboard, and herself as the queen piece moving freely across the board. One fringe story claims that Blanche practiced mild poisons, not to kill, but to influence moods and behavior, ensuring courtiers remained pliant and compliant. While there's no solid evidence, the rumor persisted, painting her as a subtly dangerous presence in the court. Historians still debate whether such claims were propaganda or an exaggeration of her strategic cunning. Blanche of Navarre died in 1441, leaving behind a kingdom somewhat stabilized by her hand but also tangled in the web of her ambitions. The court remembered her as clever, forceful, and occasionally scandalous. A queen who wielded influence as deftly as any sword, earning both admiration and fear. As you leave her sunlit palace, the scent of oranges and jasmine fading behind you, you sense her laughter echoing faintly. She had not merely survived a male-dominated world, she had danced circles around it. And as you pull your cloak tighter and move down the winding path, you hear her voice, sly and commanding. Power is sweetest when others suspect you only dally. You step now into the ornate courts of England once more, where the tapestries are heavy, the air fragrant with lavender, and the gossip thick enough to taste. This is Elizabeth Woodville, Queen Consort to Edward IV, a woman whose life was as much a whirlwind of ambition and scandal as it was of political intrigue and survival. Unlike some queens whose notoriety stemmed from public displays of sexuality, Elizabeth scandalized by marrying for love, maneuvering her family into power, and appending the expectations of the Yorkist court. Born in 1437 to a relatively modest English noble family, Elizabeth was the daughter of Richard Woodville and Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Her upbringing was genteel but not especially influential. Until fate intervened. She married Edward IV secretly in 1464, shocking the realm. A mainstream fact, Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth was indeed clandestine. He bypassed the political arrangements expected of a king, rejecting more advantageous matches that could have strengthened alliances abroad. Imagine the whispers in the halls, a king marrying beneath him, a queen whose family was considered socially inferior. The audacity alone created ripples across England. Rumors flourished almost immediately. Critics accused Elizabeth of plotting to enrich her family at court, favoring her brothers and sisters with titles and positions. The Woodvilles' sudden rise to prominence sparked resentment among older, established nobles. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth acted out of selfish ambition, maternal instinct, or merely survived in a cutthroat environment that required cunning and alliances. Either way, her court became a battleground of intrigue. A quirky tidbit, Elizabeth allegedly had a passion for fashion that became nearly legendary. She influenced trends at the English court, including extravagant gowns, elaborate headpieces, and jeweled accessories that often drew both admiration and envy. Picture her striding through Westminster Hall, silk rustling, tiara glinting, courtiers craning their necks to glimpse the latest daring design. Her style was more than vanity, it was power, signaling wealth, taste, and authority. Elizabeth's influence extended to the succession. After Edward IV's death, her sons, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were placed in the Tower of London, never to emerge publicly. Many suspected Elizabeth of being involved in the deadly intrigue surrounding the boy's disappearance, though historians still debate her exact role. Her political acumen remained sharp. She navigated alliances with Margaret Beaufort and Henry Tudor, ultimately helping secure her daughter Elizabeth of York's marriage to Henry VII. Uniting Yorkists and Tudors and ending the Wars of the Roses, the fringe tales, of course, continued. Elizabeth was rumored to wield secret knowledge, manipulating courtiers like chess pieces and keeping confidants who ensured her family's survival. One chronicler even claimed she had an uncanny ability to predict rivals' moves, giving rise to whispers that she practiced some kind of domestic witchcraft, likely exaggeration, yet a mark of her reputation as cunning and formidable. her legacy was enduring. While some painted her as scheming, power-hungry, and scandalous, she also demonstrated remarkable resilience. A queen who married for love, navigated deadly politics, and safeguarded her children's future. Elizabeth Woodville transformed what might have been personal scandal into dynastic triumph. As you drift along the shadowed corridors of Westminster, imagine her eyes flashing with determination, lips curved in quiet amusement at those who underestimated her. You can almost hear her whisper, voice calm yet commanding, "They will judge me endlessly, but I will still shape the crown." The torches flicker as you wander now into the sun-warmed halls of Spain, where golden light slants across carved wooden ceilings and the faint scent of orange groves drifts through open windows. Here waits Queen Isabella I of Castile, a figure often remembered for her unyielding religious reforms, her sponsorship of explorers, and, of course, the scandals that swirled around her marriage and political ambitions. While she may not fit the image of a perverted queen in the sexual sense, her scandal lies in her ruthless pursuit of power, her manipulation of tradition, and the audacity of her personal will. Born in 1451, Isabella was the daughter of John II of Castile. Her early years were marked by court intrigues, rivalries, and exile, giving her a keen sense of how precarious power could be. A mainstream fact, Isabella married Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469, uniting two powerful kingdoms. But the marriage was more than a simple dynastic alliance, it was a calculated power play that reshaped the political map of Spain. Imagine the murmur in the halls, a teenage bride secretly negotiating her kingdom's fate with her husband, ensuring her influence would extend far beyond the bedroom. The rumors and scandals began early. Isabella's marriage required the displacement of Ferdinand's own political expectations, and she faced criticism for the way she maneuvered to place her own allies in key positions. Historians still argue whether her actions were driven by personal ambition, genuine concern for Castile, or a combination of both. Either way, she quickly demonstrated an uncanny ability to control the levers of power, bending even resistant nobles to her will. A quirky tidbit, Isabella had an obsession with the supernatural. She was fascinated by prophecies, omens, and astrology, consulting seers and interpreting signs before major battles or political decisions. Picture her sitting in her private chambers, candlelight flickering on walls lined with maps and charts, a soothsayer whispering about the outcome of distant wars or her children's fates. This combination of superstition and strategy became a hallmark of her reign. Her reputation for scandal only intensified with the Spanish Inquisition. Isabella, alongside Ferdinand, established the Inquisition to enforce Catholic orthodoxy, expelling Jews and persecuting those deemed heretical. While contemporary critics accused her of cruelty and overreach, supporters praised her commitment to unity and faith. Historians still debate whether the Inquisition was a necessary political tool or a manifestation of authoritarian zeal. Either way, it marked her reign with controversy that has lasted for centuries. Isabella also manipulated marriages and alliances to strengthen her dynasty, often arranging her children's unions in ways that shocked other European courts. She seemed willing to sacrifice personal sentiment for political gain, a queen who treated her family as pawns in the greater game of statecraft. One fringe tale even claims she maintained a secret council of women who advised her on domestic and political strategies, a kind of proto-feminist cabinet, though historians are unsure of the details. As you wander the shadowed corridors of her Alcazar palace, it's easy to sense Isabella's presence in every carved column and tapestry. She was determined, sometimes feared, often whispered about in scandal and awe. And as your footsteps fade into silence, her voice echoes softly, commanding yet gentle. A queen's power lies not in her crown, but in her will, and mine bends all before it. The scent of damp stone and inked parchment surrounds you as you drift northward into the winding alleys of the French Renaissance, arriving at the court of Anne of Brittany. Imagine corridors lined with tapestries depicting hunting scenes, the air thick with the scent of candle wax, and the faint echo of musicians tuning lutes. Anne was a queen whose life was shaped by political necessity, yet rumor and intrigue painted her as a figure of scandal and personal audacity. even as she sought to safeguard Brittany's independence, born in 1477, and inherited the Duchy of Brittany, a fiercely independent region that resisted absorption by France. Her marriages were not just unions of love. They were political weapons. A mainstream fact, Anne married Charles VIII of France in 1491, effectively uniting Brittany and France. When Charles died in 1498, she swiftly married his successor, Louis XII, ensuring Brittany remained politically intact. These moves drew both admiration and envy, a duchess-turned-queen orchestrating her own destiny in an age when women were expected to obey. Whispers followed her like shadows. Critics claimed she manipulated both kings to maintain her power, and rumors abounded regarding her personal relationships, including alleged affairs that never could be proven. Historians still argue whether Anne was genuinely engaged in extramarital flirtations or whether these tales were a product of political enemies trying to undermine her authority. Either way, the rumors persisted, enhancing her aura of intrigue, a quirky tidbit, and had a fascination with clothing and fashion, commissioning lavish gowns embroidered with the heraldry of Brittany. She used her wardrobe as a political statement, signaling allegiance, defiance, or preference, often leaving courtiers guessing. Imagine her gliding into a council chamber, a ripple of silk proclaiming her subtle defiance to anyone daring to ignore her authority. Her influence extended beyond mere appearances. And negotiated treaties, oversaw economic reforms in Brittany, and even influenced military campaigns. Her ability to navigate the complex interplay between her duchy and the French crown required both intelligence and audacity. Courtiers often whispered that she possessed the cunning of a seasoned strategist disguised in the elegance of a queen. One fringe story claims and practiced coded communication with loyal nobles, sending secret messages through embroidered patterns on her dresses. Whether true or merely romanticized, it cemented her reputation as a queen who wielded both intellect and subtlety in ways men of her time found unnerving. Anne of Brittany died in 1514, leaving a legacy that combined political shrewdness with a personal life scrutinized by chroniclers. As you step back through the ornate halls of her palace, you feel the weight of her intelligence, her strategic mind, and the whispers of scandal that clung to her name. Her voice seems to linger in the air, calm and measured. Power is a gown I wear with care, and every stitch tells my story. The air shifts again, carrying the faint salt of the Mediterranean and the warmth of Venetian sunlight as you enter the labyrinthine palaces of Venice. Here awaits Caterina Cornaro, the Queen of Cyprus, whose life is a remarkable blend of romance, politics, and whispers of scandal, illustrating how queenship could be entwined with desire, manipulation, and intrigue even far from the typical courts of France or England. Born in 1454 into the Venetian patriciate, Caterina's youth was shaped by the wealth, connections, and expectations of one of Europe's most mercantile republics. At just 15, she married James II of Cyprus, union arranged to solidify Venetian influence on the island. A mainstream fact, through her marriage, Caterina became Queen Consort of Cyprus, a tiny but strategically crucial kingdom. Yet her role extended far beyond mere ceremonial duties. She became a political actor in her own right, navigating the precarious waters between local nobility and Venetian interests. Rumors quickly swirled. Some suggested that Caterina wielded her charm to influence court decisions and even the king himself, leveraging her beauty and intelligence in ways contemporaries found audacious or even improper. Historians still argue whether these accounts were grounded in truth or exaggerated by observers uncomfortable with a young queen exercising influence, yet they cemented her reputation as both clever and scandalous. A quirky tidbit, Caterina was reputed to be a skilled horsewoman, often riding unaccompanied through the hills of Cyprus, a behavior considered daring for a woman of her rank. Imagine courtiers watching her gallop across the sunlit fields, hair flying, cloak billowing, knowing full well that gossip would travel faster than she could ever ride. This physical display of independence was both admired and maligned. After James II's death, Caterina became regent for her young son, James III. Tragically, he died as an infant, leaving Caterina the sole ruler of Cyprus. Venice saw opportunity. The Republic gradually tightened control, pressuring her to abdicate. Yet she navigated the situation with diplomacy, negotiating a pension and securing her personal estates while ceding political control. The scandal wasn't overtly sexual this time, but the whispers focused on her audacity to maintain power, her manipulation of Venetian officials, and her independence in a male-dominated Mediterranean world. Fringe tales even suggest that Caterina used secret correspondence and coded signals to maintain influence over her former court, ensuring that her allies remained in positions of power. Whether true or legend, it reinforced the perception that she was a queen who refused to be entirely sidelined, wielding subtle, persistent power long after her formal reign ended. Caterina retired to Venice, living comfortably yet constantly observed, her life a testament to a queen's ability to negotiate survival, influence, and legacy in a world eager to reduce her to mere rumor or scandal. As you leave the gilded halls of her Venetian palace, the faint sounds of gondolas and lapping water echo around you. You hear her voice, calm and composed, carrying the weight of experience and quiet defiance. I lost the crown, but not my mind. Or my secrets. The air grows cooler and the sky dimmer as you drift into the shadowed hills of medieval Scotland, where mist clings to stone battlements and the smell of peat fires drifts through narrow alleys. Here stands Margaret Tudor, a queen whose life intertwined scandal, politics, and a persistent defiance of expectation, a figure whose influence, choices, and personal entanglements left ripples across Scotland and England alike. Born in 1489, Margaret was the daughter of Henry VII of England, destined from birth to serve as a political bridge. In 1503, she married James IV of Scotland, creating a union designed to bring peace between warring kingdoms. A mainstream fact, the marriage did indeed produce political stability for a time and produced heirs, including James V. But Margaret's life was never simple, never just about alliances. The story of her personal life and influence is tangled in love, betrayal, and political maneuvering. The scandals began early. Rumors abounded regarding her romantic liaisons outside of marriage, particularly after James IV's death in 1513 at Flodden, leaving Margaret as regent for her young son. Historians still argue whether some alleged affairs were exaggerated or invented by jealous courtiers and foreign diplomats eager to discredit a powerful widow. Yet the stories fueled her reputation as a queen willing to flout expectation for personal and political survival. A quirky tidbit, Margaret reportedly enjoyed hunting and often rode astride. Much like a man, shocking Scottish nobles unaccustomed to seeing a queen wielding a bow with skill. Imagine her dashing through forests, her skirts tucked up, arrows flying, while gossiping courtiers whispered about her unconventional behavior. It was another way she defied the rigid social norms of the time. Margaret's regency was fraught with challenges. Factional disputes erupted among Scottish nobles, and she faced pressure to remarry to secure alliances. In 1514, she married Archibald Douglas, a union that caused uproar because he was considered socially inferior and politically unreliable. Critics claimed she allowed him undue influence over the kingdom, further fueling scandal. Historians still debate whether her choice was a desperate strategy to secure protection and continuity for her children or a personal decision driven by affection, or both. Her influence extended through careful diplomacy. Margaret navigated the treacherous waters between Scotland and England, balancing loyalties, protecting her son's inheritance, and ensuring her family's continued prominence. She often acted decisively, making enemies and allies alike. A queen who understood that her survival depended on audacity and adaptability. Fringe tales also suggest that Margaret used coded correspondence and secret networks to manage her political and personal affairs, ensuring that her will remained felt even when others tried to control her. Whether legend or reality, these stories enhanced her reputation as clever, daring, and dangerously independent. Margaret Tudor died in 1541, leaving a legacy of scandal, resilience, and influence. Her life demonstrates how queenship could be both a public stage and a private theater of ambition, desire, and strategic cunning. As you leave the Scottish mists behind, the scent of peat and pine fading. You hear her voice one last time, soft and resolute. To be a queen is to survive, to bend, to intrigue, and to endure beyond the whispers. The mist begins to thin, the world outside your mind's eye softening into a gentle haze. The queens you've wandered with, Christina of Sweden, Margaret of Anjou, Joanna II of Naples, Hedvig Eleonora, Blanche of Navarre, Elizabeth Woodville, Isabella I of Castile, and of Brittany, Caterina Cornaro, Margaret Tudor, fade into memory like figures receding down long palace corridors. Their audacity, ambition, and defiance linger, yet now the urgency and tension ease. You feel your body sink deeper into the warmth of your blanket, the soft hum of the night wrapping around you like a familiar cloak. Each queen, with her scandals, whispers, and sharp cunning, was human, flawed, and fearless in ways that make your own anxieties seem lighter by comparison. The echoes of their laughter, their whispered commands, their secretive glances, drift around you without sharpness, only the faint sparkle of intrigue, curiosity, and mischief. Imagine the halls of their palaces slowing down, tapestries stilling, torches dimming, gardens growing quiet. The scent of lavender, pine, orange blossoms, and candle wax fades, leaving only the soft rhythm of your own breathing. You feel the pulse of history slowing to the same rhythm as your heartbeat, the chaotic courtly intrigues settling into a gentle, timeless lull. Remember that each of these queens lived under immense pressure, yet they found ways to express desire, intellect, and audacity, bending rules, manipulating circumstance, or simply walking away when the throne could no longer contain them. Their stories are threads in a tapestry that stretches across centuries, woven from courage, cunning, and quiet rebellion. They are both distant and present, and now, as your eyelids grow heavier, you carry a faint echo of their strength with you. Let your thoughts drift over the landscapes you've crossed, the frozen palaces of Sweden, the sun-drenched halls of Spain, the winding streets of France and Scotland. Each corner of history hums softly, and each queen's whisper becomes a lullaby, gentle and unwavering. Power, survival, intelligence, audacity, rest easy. The stories have been told, and now the night holds you gently. The world narrows to the soft rhythm of breath, the subtle creak of blankets, the whisper of wind through your window. You are safe. You are calm. And slowly, inexorably, the courtly intrigue, the whispered scandals, and the daring queens fade into dreams.